Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Paulitics Show. Today, we're going to be talking about D.C. statehood. When the U.S. left the British Crown during the 1700s, we had 13 states. But in 1959, we adopted Hawaii as our 50th. However, today, there reigns a debate throughout the halls of Congress and throughout this nation about a 51st state, the District of Washington D.C. Should it be a state? So in today's episode, we're going to break down the legality of that and whether or not I believe it should be a state. So without any more to say, let's jump into it. To begin, I just want to first provide some what I think are interesting facts about DC as a territory and as a district, as opposed to it being a state. And in order to truly understand why it is not a state and to understand the debate that rages on today, we ought to understand the history behind DC and why it was deemed a territory and why it is where it is. So an interesting fact that if any of you have ever seen the musical Hamilton, you'll know that there's a song called The Room Where It Happens. And this is actually based on a historically accurate debate that took place between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson, a Virginian, and Alexander Hamilton, a New Yorker. Hamilton had the Capitol in New York. That was the original intent for where the Capitol building would be. Jefferson was a Virginian and wanted the Capitol closer to the middle of the country and to where he was located. However, at the time, a debate was raging about a national bank. Should there be one? And that's an actual discussion about whether or not that could be the case, whether or not that was a good thing for this country that I'm not going to get into. But what wound up happening is we wound up instituting a national bank, and in return, the capital was moved from New York to Virginia. Alexander Hamilton got the bank he wanted, and Jefferson got the capital moved to the Virginia and Maryland area. And in the Constitution itself, it subscribes that there is going to be a 10 square mile by 10 square mile place where this capital of the United States would be located. And that was deemed by the at the time President George Washington where it would be located. But the Constitution also grants Congress the exclusive right to assert power over such a district. So because it allows Congress to do that, in other words, DC, the city, doesn't have a municipal legislature. There is no city council, and at the time, there was no mayor. However, as we all know, that changed. Over time, particularly during the 1960s, rights were given to these residents of Washington, D.C. They were given the right to elect a mayor. They were given the right to elect city council members and municipal government. And that was actually something James Madison wanted in Federalist 43. He said that, yes, he did not believe that Washington, D.C. as a city should be a state. He did not want them to have a seat at the federal government legislature or anything like that. But what he did want is he did want them to have a municipal government, which is what they wound up getting in the 60s during the LBJ administration. However, what they didn't have is they didn't have any control of the federal politics until 1961. And this occurred in particular with this 23rd Amendment. The 23rd Amendment allowed the District of Washington, D.C. to have 3 electoral college votes when voting for president. Yet they were still not granted a senator, and they were still not granted a House of Representative member. They just had the 3 votes in presidential elections. So now that we have some background on the actual logistics of how DC works, what rights they don't have, let's look into why I believe that DC should be a state. And later in this episode, I'm going to get into the arguments against that. But first, let me just note the 3 arguments that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about population size. I'm going to be talking about taxation without representation, and the creation of home rule authority. And what that means in particular is that I believe that Congress treats DC like its backyard. It doesn't have any right to do anything, the city of DC. And I'm going to get into that later in this episode, but to begin with, I'm going to be talking about population size. And you might be wondering, well, that seems like an arbitrary argument. Why are you bringing that up? And the answer is actually quite simple. DC, you might think, well, it's very small, it's not a lot of room geographically, so there can't be all too many people. But what if I told you that if it was going to be a state, It would have the third highest, it wouldn't be the least populated state. That award goes to Wyoming, with roughly 580,000 Americans. Vermont is 630,000 Americans. D.C. has 705,000 Americans. It's substantially more than Vermont, substantially more than Wyoming. It has more than these two states, yet it's not considered a state. And a fun fact is that in order to get a congressional representative in Congress, every state is guaranteed one, but in order to get an additional one, you have to have 700,000 citizens living within your state. Washington clarifies for that. Wyoming, Vermont, simply, they don't. They don't even pass the simple limit for how many people it mandates to get a member in the House of Representatives. D.C. would. But that just brings me to my next point. The amount of people living in D.C. Those 705,000 people are being drastically disenfranchised. They don't have a say at the table. They are being taxed at the highest rate per capita when compared to any other state around this country. If they were to be a state, they're being taxed at a higher rate per capita, but they're not being represented in the Congress. Their voice is meaningless in federal politics. And you could make the argument that, well, they are closer to the Capitol, to the Congress built, to the Capitol Hill, and to the White House, and to the Supreme Court, therefore that they have a louder influence. But in the age of communication, in the age of cheap airfare, that argument goes out the window. Maybe in the olden days where you had to take a horse and buggy to get from one place to another, but in the 21st century when you can hop on a plane, when you can drive in your car, and you can just go on Zoom and talk to someone, or FaceTime with someone, or Skype with someone, that argument's thrown out the window. But I next also want to declare what was said by James Otis in 1761, where he said that taxation without representation is tyranny. And that is something I absolutely believe. We can get into the argument about how much someone should be taxed. That's a whole different discussion. But they in themselves are not getting representative. They don't have a seat at the table. They are getting their money robbed from them, and in return are not even getting the basic supply of democracy. Democracy only works if they're consenting, and they're giving up their money, which is their consent. This is a social contract theory, where they're giving up their money to consent to being governed. But in this case, they're only giving up their money. They're not consenting to what's occurring. If you ask the majority of people that live in D.C., the fact of the matter is, they want to become a state. And on that very notion alone, you might be thinking, well, the overwhelming majority of people that live in D.C., they have multiple addresses. Politicians, for instance, newscasters, and things of that sort. But what if I told you that 88% of people that live in Washington, D.C. are permanent residency is in Washington, D.C.? That means only 12% of the D.C. population is allocated to outside of that region. So that means that the overwhelming majority of people that live in Washington, D.C. are being disenfranchised. Their voices are not being heard. And if you remember to what the Revolutionary War was fought over, it was on the notion that there should be no taxation without representation. You should not tread on me. As they like to say, as the Republicans and conservatives like to say, you shall not tread on me. Well, the fact of the matter is, we are treading on the people of D.C. You have swapped your ideological terms. Those people are not being enfranchised, and they're being taxed at unproportionate rates per capita. And they're reaping none of the rewards. And that brings me to my next point. You might be saying, well, Paul, you mentioned before that Washington, D.C. does have a city council. It does have a municipal board. It does have a mayor. And as an extension, they would be able to create their own laws and things like that. And that's partially true. Congress oversees every aspect of D.C. law. And what that means is during the 60s, there was this thing called the Home Rule Authority, which basically said that D.C. laws and budgets must be approved via the same congressional process that a congressional law, federal law, would have to go through. So let me explain that process for you very quickly. First, the D.C. bill starts off in a congressional subcommittee. Once it moves through that, it goes to committee. It passes the House, and the same process is taking place simultaneously in the Senate. So it goes through the subcommittee of the Senate, its committee in the Senate, then it goes to the floor of both the House and the Senate. Afterward, the Senate and the House reconcile the differences within the bill, and then it goes to the president for him to veto. Now, that process is very good when you're trying to manipulate and create federal law, because you want something that's a moderate approach. You don't want something so radical or extreme from either side. As the Senate is famously called, it's the cooling plate of politics. It's supposed to be the most deliberative body on the face of this planet. Yet, when you're talking about state law, and because federal politics is often much more radicalized and much more politicized than state law, the same process then occurs to D.C. laws. So, for instance, there have been in cases where the D.C. legislature, the D.C. City Council, tries to approve a law and Congress blocks it. Take, for instance, the needle exchange program taking place from 1999 to 2007. Republicans in the House of Representatives blocked the thing from occurring. Take, for instance, abortion law. They blocked abortion rules from taking place. Or what about gun control? Or marijuana? The marijuana one, which to me is particularly absurd. There was an election that occurred in Washington, D.C., a district-wide referendum on the issue of medical marijuana. And this was taking place in the 90s. I think it was in 1998. And there was a referendum on this issue. And it had a 68% approval. So it was likely going to pass the referendum. However, Congressman Bob Barr added a provision to the end of a D.C. budget bill to block funding to count the votes. So the election took place and it wound up winning. The issue of medical marijuana getting passed wound up winning. However, that had to be counted by an outside group because Bob Barr blocked funding for those votes to be counted because he was a staunch opponent of medical marijuana legalization. To me, that's tyrannical. That is not sovereignty. We want to say that all people in this country are free people to pursue life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, but at the end of the day, these people are not able to pursue happiness if they are not granted the same sovereignty of every other American throughout this nation. Now, there is opposition to making D.C. a state, and I'm thoroughly going to recognize that. And perhaps one of the largest opponents of D.C. statehood happened to be one of our founding fathers, James Madison. James Madison was a staunch critic of D.C. statehood, particularly in Federalist number 43.
The founders created Washington as a federal city so that the operations of government would be safe and free from domination by the states around it. James Madison wrote in Federalist 43 that the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It's so obvious as to be self-evident. Without complete control over its territory, Madison wrote, the government might be insulted and its proceedings interrupted with impunity. Hostile magistrates or an angry mob might interfere with the people's elected representatives or even usurp the government. Now, this was no abstract concern for the founders. Just 5 years before Madison wrote those words, several hundred mutinous soldiers assailed the Congress in Philadelphia.
Well, the Democrats' plan, H.R. 51, which is the bill that passed the House just a couple days ago, actually remedies this issue. In other words, what would occur is the White House, the Supreme Court, and the Capitol Hill will be cut out into their own new version of D.C. The new D.C., the new state, would be called Washington, I believe it's called State of Washington Douglas Commonwealth. Whereas the new D.C. would comprise, as I said, of the White House, the Supreme Court, and the Capitol building. The new D.C., as in the new state, would comprise a 60 square mile diameter, creating a new state and all the quote-unquote important federal buildings that people would want to target in case of what Tom Cotton calls insurrection. Those buildings would be able to easily be protected. Now you're saying, well, what about the Department of Defense? What about the Pentagon? Those are outside of the limits within the boundaries of D.C. And that argument is fair. However, when we talk about how much land the federal government owns in other states, let's utilize, for instance, Nevada and Utah. In Utah, they own over half of all the land, and because they own over half of all the land, the federal government is able to do as they please there, because it is their land. In the case of Nevada, they own 63% of the land of Nevada. So there's easily so much stuff, they can easily take over little bits and pieces of this new state being D.C., while enfranchising those people the right to vote. Because at the end of the day, that is the most important functioning piece of a democracy. If people aren't granted the right to vote, well, the fact of the matter is, they're being disenfranchised. They are being not represented. They're not being represented. And that is something that we can easily remedy. And one of the other fears that I've recently seen occurring, and that has to do with, as what Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, and a variety of other GOP senators have called a Democrat power grab. And the fact of the matter is, if you were confident in your ideology, it can win anywhere. And I understand that in this particular instance, the state of the District of D.C. has gone Democrat in every single election since it was given the 23rd Amendment. However, if you are strong enough in your ideology, you can win anywhere. It happens in New York. It happens throughout this entire country. The Republicans have the potential to win anywhere if it's a strong ideology. If it's an ideology that you actually believe in. If it's an ideology you believe can win, it can win. So this is actually where I'm going to be ending today's episode. Next week, I think we're going to be talking about campaign finance reform, which is a very, very, very interesting topic because it's a firm belief that, well, similar to this, where people are being disenfranchised, what if the entire country was being disenfranchised? So, without any more to say, I'll see you in next week's episode.